Silvercrow.
Welcome to the Urban Witch Podcast, where modern magic meets ancient wisdom. On today's episode, we'll be looking at the history of witchcraft, right from the first uses in prehistoric times, right up through the Middle Ages, and right to the present day. So stay tuned for this fascinating episode. There are lots of the practices that we do as modern witches that have their basis and have their foundations in ancient practices. But the vast majority of our modern practices, modern rituals, modern spells, modern traditions are far, far removed from traditional pagan type practices. Going back to right as far back as prehistory, as far as prehistoric times, the practices, magical practices from early humans has been abundant all the way through the world, across the world. There's been we've found cave paintings that seem to suggest some form of magical ritualistic practice. Usually these practices were to do with important events or important moments within the lives of the people at the time, and often that would be events such as fertility type rituals, abundance and bringing in being able to find food, protection from wild creatures and from dangers of certain locations. And so all of these things, all of these types of ceremonial and ritualistic practices have formed the early foundations of what we know of magic today. And if we sort of go a little bit forward into time, there's lots of various different the different cultures across the world will also have different types and different styles of witchcraft practice or different styles of magical practice, and these differ widely right across cultures. If we take a huge jump from prehistoric times all the way to sort of ancient Egypt, the ancient Egyptians, there was no real distinction between religion, spirituality, and magic. It was all one and the same. And often a lot of their magic was based around the gods, the various different gods, the pantheon of gods that they had. And it was always to do with the smooth and peaceful transition towards the afterlife. There was, we have well-documented cases of mummies and practices of mummifying animals, practices of elaborate sort of golden tombs and headdresses that were used, as well as various sort of ritualistic practices such as the embalming process and mummification process. Even early sort of curse bottles and that type of thing were used in that sort of time. And then we have, ancient Sumeria, where we have evidence of magical practice and ritual with ancient Sumeria. We have evidence of magical practice and ritual within ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and so on and so on. In fact, pretty much every culture on Earth has a history of magic, and I think sometimes we, particularly through our modern lens, we regard magic as something of the other. It's something of the supernatural or something of the fanciful or fantastical. But really, in those ancient cultures, it made up everyday life. It made up part of everyday life, and it was a big part of everyday life. If we look at the various different sort of archaeological structures that were created in ancient times, we have some phenomenally built temples that all sort of are pointed towards the sun or the moon or various different star alignments, and so that it was clear that they were tracking celestial bodies, and it was all in an attempt to sort of connect with the gods in that type of way. And so over time this has kind of shifted, and while the cultures across the world perform their magical rites and traditions in a different way, they are all pagan in structure. And I think there's a kind of tendency among a lot of modern pagans or a lot of modern witches, where they seem to believe that to be pagan is practicing in this specific way. But really, that's not how it is. Pagan as a colloquial term encompasses a wide variety of types of practice. Pagan practice, it's wildly different across cultures. And while there are some commonalities in the fact that there are often numerous gods or goddesses that are worshipped or prayed to, or offerings left for, and so on, the practices themselves are often wildly different. And so the practices that we find in West African countries and the practices we find in Slavic nations or Scandinavian nations, or European or British or American, all of those types of different cultures, they all approached a similar way of being in a different way. All of them tracked, celestial bodies across the sky. They all tracked star systems, constellations, the sun, the moon, etc., comets and asteroids even. But they all did it in a slightly different way. And so as we kind of go through the ages, we get to the point where when we talk about sort of the whole worship, the connection between worship and magic, there's not a distinction with many cultures. The magic and worship go hand in hand. And while our modern practices, a lot of modern witchcraft practice is very, I guess, not anti-religion necessarily, but sort of it's seen as this sort of thing that is separate to religion. Religion sits over here and magic sits over here, but that's not always been the case. And the vast majority of ancient cultures utilize magic as a form of worship, as part of their religious and spiritual practice, and many still do now. We have lots of cultures that, in fact, all cultures have maintained their magical and pagan roots within their modern day. And we only have to look at a lot of the festivals and celebrations that happen throughout the world to see like the remnants of these ancient practices and these ancient magical rites. Really, there's within cave paintings in South America, in Peru, in parts of the UK, in parts of the Americas, parts of Africa, we find like carvings and sort of magical symbols and remnants of magic and sort of archaeological finds of magical practice. Things like structures created out of bones or teeth were quite common, and that seem to have something about like a protective nature or a ritualistic practice about animal sacrifice, perhaps, a sacrificial creature of some kind towards the gods, whether that was human sacrifice or animal sacrifice. Both were sacrificed, at various points in time by various different cultures. And even in the terms of kind of the we know a lot of pagan and witchcraft practices now. We use fire a lot, and we have like bonfires, which are the sort of like a standard element that we all most of us really work with. But the very name of a bonfire, comes from the conception of bone fire. The original bonfires were actually called bone fires. And they were, as they sound, it was the burning of bones, the burning of animal sacrifices, offering up an animal or possibly even humans at some point in time to offering up those sacrifices to the gods and to be claimed by the fire. And therefore the bones are sort of, charred and left over. And so we see those practices all over the world. We see similar practices around animal sacrifice and animal ritualistic sacrifice. And that some of that sort of maintained to the modern day practices that we have in certain places now. If we come forward again in time to sort of the medieval period, then we find that we have a lot of, particularly in sort of Western England and Ireland and Scotland, we have a lot of similar kind of practices going on, and they've shifted as they've gone along. During the medieval period, we had a kind of an amalgamation and a somewhat of a magical revival period, I guess you could say. It kind of amalgamated with Christianity, and with some of those Christian practices, as well as, in England at least, we have sort of Anglo-Saxons, and we had invasions from the Norse Scandinavians, that we'd call Vikings. So many of those various different cultures that came into England brought with them their traditions, their magical practices, their magical rites, and they kind of started to become amalgamated with the sort of native magical practices of the day. And then, as Christianity came in, it started to sort of shift and take some of those practices and merge them with its own teachings in order to sort of become more easily assimilated into the British, the sort of Western way of life in that way. And so we have this whole underpinning of our society even now, based firmly in ancient magical practice. And magical practice now, it's not anything like what would have been back in the day. Much of the magical practice now, much of witchcraft now that most of us kind of practice, is based around very recent, I guess, kind of a recent standardization of practice. Even though, I'm not Wiccan by any stretch of the imagination. I don't practice in the Wiccan type way. But it's, the vast majority of stuff that you will see, particularly online, the vast majority of the stuff that you see online is based around Wicca and Wiccan practice or Wiccan type practice. And even, the notion of things like correspondences, the herb correspondences, spell correspondences, and all of those types of things. Now, correspondences are like, for those that don't know, they're like it's kind of like a standardized format, I guess, where you with the symbolism, the meanings, and the connections to various different deities, and various different outcomes that you would connect to herbs, colors, various other objects. So for instance, you may use something like cinnamon for good luck or for abundance or something like that. So, and black is associated with absorbing energy and protection of negativity and all that. And so you get these associations, but those things weren't always like that. Those weren't kind of the ancient ways of practicing. They're more of a modern thing, and really more of a 20th century type way of practicing, even though some of the finer details may have kind of slipped through the net of time and sort of become amalgamated with modern day practice. A lot of the practices we do now are based in more recent types of practice. It's important to remember, I think, that further back in time, the further back we go, then obviously, that what we know of those ancient cultures gets misty the further back you try to go. And the fog of time kind of muddies the waters of the practices of ancient pagans, or the practices of ancient witches, or whatever you would want to call them, or the herbal practices and treatments of cunning folk, for instance, in the Middle Ages. So you can kind of see that things start to get a bit blurry as we go back. But really, I guess the turning point for much of it was during the medieval period. And you have a bit of an amalgamation of various different belief systems. So we had sort of Hermeticism that came into being within like the kind of, it's kind of a revival of ancient Egyptian philosophy that was brought in sort of within sort of like the medieval and Renaissance type period, and with it came other other types of practice. We had like herbalistic stuff that came out a lot later, and so you have kind of these mashups of various different magical practice and ritualistic practice that kind of got blended and shifted and changed, and it kind of went on like that then. And really that started to kind of form the underpinnings of the alchemy, sort of the age of alchemy, within, even though kind of alchemy is an ancient practice in itself, it became more of a, I guess, more of a revival. It had more of a revival in like the Renaissance period, and you have like famous alchemists that utilize this way of practicing and this standardization. You know, they created the alchemical symbols that we have now, that we use now for a lot of things. You know, the alchemical symbols for various different elements of the earth, and so you had that the famous alchemists such as Nicholas Flamel, John Dee, and Paracelsus. You know, they're sort of three of the kind of like really famous sort of early alchemists who worked in this way, in this manner, and it became like where that started to become where science shifted into magic, and there was a bit of a crossover with that, and as we've gone forward in time, you know, really that is still true to today, really, to an extent. You know, much of the pharmaceutical industry that we have now and the modern medicines have come about through these ancient sort of herbal practices and ancient alchemical practices. You know, chemistry itself comes from alchemy in that way. You know, and so all of these kind of alchemical practices, these herbal practices and herbal remedies, have kind of been the building blocks for what we know of as modern medicine and what we know of as modern ways of being, you know, modern healthcare, modern belief systems. And it's all sort of bled and transformed and evolved over time. And so really I guess the big sort of, I guess the big crossover, big switchover really, of how witchcraft kind of became a big part of British life, at least, really came about with the 1542 Witchcraft Act. Now, this was an act of Parliament that was passed by the British government at the time, which essentially outlawed witchcraft and placed it into the realms of satanic maleficium, which is essentially like the sort of harmful magic, and magic that's intended to cause injury or death or loss, you know. So that then became a capital crime, and it became punishable by death. So when that started to happen, then in the sort of early 16th century, then what we have then is a real shift of what magic is and what it and how it's practiced and what it becomes. Prior to this, really, magic was perfectly acceptable. It was always accepted as just something that is part of tradition, you know, and a part of these ancient traditions, of healing and of spirituality and just celebration of being, essentially. And so it after this happened, it was all sort of, before this happened, it was all kind of fairly accepted and it was perfectly fine. After the passing of the Witchcraft Act, then things started to shift. And even though the Witchcraft Act itself, the Witchcraft Act of 1542 was repealed about 5 years later, before it was redefined and kind of put on the statute books again, in sort of like 1562. And so then it started to then take on this whole process of satanic worship that became satanic witchcraft. So that became a thing then that was associated with witches. So then you start to see this association start to weave of witches being evil and witches being these terrible demonic beings who work with the devil to cause harm and suffering to mankind. And so that was kind of the real shift um, of how this went, of how magical practice started to change and shift and evolve then. And a lot of it went underground. A lot of it, people would still continue to practice these things, but usually sort of behind closed doors. Herbal healers kept it kind of closely guarded to themselves, and they practiced sort of folk healing was still prevalent. Folk healing was still the main form of healing. This was prior to modern medicine, and so there was no other way of healing. People would still seek cunning women and cunning men to heal them of their ailments and to remove curses and to bless their livestock and so on and so on and so on, bless the harvest and all of that stuff. So this was still, very much in a part of daily magical life, and particularly within folk traditions, within folk magic, that was the prevalent magic. Then in 1604, then we have the Witchcraft Act was kind of it was changed and altered slightly so that it took the power away from the church, so that it was no longer the church's authority that dealt with witches. It became a court authority, so it was passed from the church to the courts, and then that's where things started to take a bit of a turn for the worse then. And so when you come forward, to modern days now, what we see now is we have this kind of real, we talk about the witch wound a lot. So there's a very real kind of ancestral and sort of DNA based wound almost particularly within women, but also it affects men as well, where it's kind of been transferred over the centuries to us. And so it clouds some of our actions now. Some of the things that we do now, there's still a very deep suspicion with among human to human. We have this kind of real I guess a weariness about other people, and it's carried from those sort of times. And then now when we think about modern practice, as we practice magic now as witches, then we again, as I spoke about earlier, we have the correspondences and the associations with various different outcomes that we want. And when we craft a spell now, we often use herbs or crystals or various different types of liquids, candles. All of those things kind of seem to be like the standard thing. If you ask someone how a witch casts a spell, they will conjure in their minds, images of various different things that are that would possibly be used for casting a spell. And some of those would be correct, and some of them would be sort of merely what we've seen on film and in books. So you can kind of see how things have shifted, and you can kind of see how there is this sort of mismatch of stereotypes and ancient practice and modern practices. And when we get into the 20th century, we start to see figures like Gerald Gardner, who introduces Wicca to the world. And Wicca is essentially a neo-pagan kind of modern day practice that was set up in about the 1930s. It kind of started to come to prevalence, and then had a bit of a resurgence in the 70s. And so you start to see this kind of new age practice. But what Gerald Gardner did, and others at the time, Aleister Crowley was another well-known witch at the time. Gerald Gardner, Sybil Leek, and many others during this sort of period, where they've kind of brought in magic, or brought in various different ancient practices, and they've borrowed them from various different cultures. There's a lot of practices borrowed from ancient Egypt, the sort of ritualistic and ceremonial magic from ancient Egypt, mixed with magic from ancient Greece and Rome, and so on and so on. And they've been kind of mashed together, and also Celtic practices and Norse, Scandinavian practices. So they've all been kind of mashed together, and Wicca is the result of that. There's lots of, the vast majority of things that you see online now will be Wiccan based. They will be based around Wiccan practice. The whole thing with like the rule of three, or do unto others what what you would have done to you, or if you cast something out, then you're going to get it back 10 times or 3 times or whatever. All of those types of rules, like the rules based thing, like the Wiccan Rede is purely Wiccan. It didn't exist prior to Wicca. It was just there are no rules within witchcraft. There are no kind of guidelines in that way. Witchcraft is about practicing as you wish and as you see fit and according to your free will. But Wicca kind of standardized it and gave it a kind of rebranded it, I guess, rebranded a lot of these ancient magical practices and sort of smashed them together with a bit of sort of new age woo-woo. And so what we see now in modern Wiccan practice is very much that, it's very much the an amalgamation of various different cultures, whereas ancient pagan practice would have been very much of that culture. Scandinavian, Norse, Vikings would have worshipped in a Scandinavian Norse way, and ancient Celts would have worshipped in an ancient Celt way, and so on. But now you have this sort of mashup of ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient Celtic, Gaelic type practices, and you have bits and pieces of Scottish history and culture. You have bits and pieces of Native American culture, and it's kind of borrowed across from various different cultures, and we see mashups of lots of types of cultures within the same practice. So that's kind of how Wicca has kind of colored, I guess you could say Wicca's kind of colored what magic is or what witchcraft is. And the predominant practices in the Western world at the minute within our for modern magic is Wiccan practice. To understand the deeper and the more spiritual and more, I guess, the more traditional types of practice, then we have to dig deep into history, and we have to really start to study what it is to be a witch, what a witch is, what it was, and even the word witch is a relatively modern word compared to older meanings for a similar thing. So really, we have to kind of really dig into history, and we have to understand folklore and folkloric stories from ancient cultures, which within all folklore and all oral traditions, there will be threads of truth that run through that give us clues about how they practice and what they practice. And remember, this was a lot of the time was before writing, before humans developed a written system. So it was passed down orally. And just as many Native Americans do now, they pass their oral traditions down, and so on, and lots of other cultures. All cultures at one point passed down these oral traditions, and so there's very little, reliable written records of this stuff. And it's only sort of in the medieval period that we really start to see written accounts of this stuff. Really, there's bits and pieces before that, but a lot of it comes from sort of the medieval period onwards. So digging into ancient cultures is a great way of unlocking your ancient sort of pagan ritualistic practice, understanding how magic evolved and where it came from. And the more we look into the history, into the sort of sands of time, and we look into the myths of the past, we learn so much about now. Ancient wisdom can teach us so much about our modern lives, and it can teach us so much about how we live our lives now, how we balance our energies, how we balance our lives, how we balance ourselves mentally and physically and spiritually. And so I think by combining these sort of, yes, practice in the way that is kind of accustomed to you, if it's obviously we practice him within the context of modern times. But I think if we can incorporate some of these ancient practices and this ancient knowledge, and we can gain a good understanding of how magic has evolved and how witchcraft has evolved over the centuries, over the millennia, then I think we gain a real strong foundation on which to build our own practice. Thanks for joining us today on the Urban Witch Podcast. Don't forget, you can check us out online on Facebook, Instagram, and X. at Silvercrow UK, or you can check out our brilliant website at silvercrow.uk. Until next time, stay wild, stay wise, and keep the magic alive. Take care.